The morning sun cast long shadows across my backyard as I stood at the edge of my kidney-shaped pool, staring into the murky green water that had become my personal nightmare. 3 weeks, that's how long it had been since Hurricane Delilah had swept through our quiet suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook Estates, leaving behind a trail of debris, fallen branches, and in my case, a pool that looked more like a swamp than the pristine oasis I'd spent years perfecting. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'd been living in this picture-perfect community for 7 years. When Sarah and I first moved here with our twin daughters, Emma and Lily, we thought we'd found paradise, the manicured lawns, the friendly neighbors. The sense of security that came with living in a well-maintained HOA community, it all seemed perfect. But as I've learned over the years, perfection often comes with a price, and that price usually involves dealing with people who have way too much time on their hands and an unhealthy obsession with other people's business. The pool had been my pride and joy. I'd spent countless weekends teaching the girls how to swim, hosting neighborhood barbecues, and enjoying quiet evening swims after long days at the accounting firm. But now, looking at the algae-covered mess before me, I felt a familiar knot. A frustration building in my chest. The hurricane had deposited everything from tree branches to what looked suspiciously like someone's garden gnome, and despite my best efforts with the pool vacuum and chemical treatments, the water had turned an unsettling shade of green that reminded me of split pea soup. I'd called 3 different pool companies, and each had given me the same advice: drain it completely and start fresh. The cost of the chemicals alone to salvage the existing water would exceed the cost of refilling the pool, not to mention the time and effort involved. It was a no-brainer from a practical standpoint, but I'd been hesitating for one specific reason: Karen Weatherby. Karen lived in the house directly behind mine, and our backyards were separated by a 6-foot privacy fence that might as well have been made of glass for all the privacy it provided from her prying eyes. She was the self-appointed guardian of our HOA's rules and regulations, a woman who seemed to have memorized every single line of our community's covenants and restrictions. In the 7 years I'd lived here, Karen had filed complaints about everything from the height of my grass, apparently half an inch too long after a particularly busy week at work, to the color of my mailbox, which she claimed was off-white, rather than the regulation pure white, though I swear they looked identical. But it wasn't just her obsession with rules that made Karen such a formidable neighbor. It was her uncanny ability to escalate minor issues into major neighborhood drama. She had the HOA board president on speed dial, maintained a detailed log of every perceived violation in the neighborhood, and had somehow convinced herself that she was single-handedly maintaining the property values of our entire community. Through her vigilant enforcement of regulations, the irony wasn't lost on me that Karen's own backyard looked like a garden center had exploded in it. She had at least 15 different varieties of plants, a collection of bird feeders that attracted what felt like every seagull on the East Coast, and a massive vegetable garden that she tended with the dedication of a medieval monk. But somehow, all of this chaos was perfectly within HOA guidelines. While my occasional late-night pool pump, or the slightly tootly sunflowers that Emma had planted near the fence, were apparently threats to the very fabric of civilized society. Standing there that Tuesday morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to drain my pool, HOA Karen be damned. I'd checked the community regulations 3 times, called the management company twice, and even consulted with my neighbor Bill, who'd served on the HOA board for 2 terms before stepping down in what he called exhausted defeat. There was absolutely nothing in our covenants that prohibited draining a pool for maintenance purposes. In fact, the regulations specifically mentioned that homeowners were responsible for maintaining their pools in a clean and sanitary condition, which my current swamp situation definitely wasn't. I'd planned it all out carefully. The pool held about 20,000 gallons of water, and I'd arranged for a water removal service to pump most of it out and haul it away in tanker trucks. The remaining water would be drained through my property's drainage system, which was designed to handle runoff from heavy rains anyway. I'd even called the city's environmental department to make sure I wasn't violating any municipal regulations. Everything was perfectly legal and above board. The work was scheduled to start at 8 a.m. on a Thursday morning. I'd chosen Thursday specifically because Karen usually left for her weekly grocery shopping trip at 7:30 a.m. and didn't return until afternoon. giving me a solid window to get the bulk of the work done before she could interfere. I'd learned from previous experiences that it was always easier to ask for forgiveness than permission when it came to Karen, mainly because she never actually gave permission for anything. But as I stood there that Tuesday morning, 2 days before the scheduled drainage, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to poke a sleeping bear. Karen had been unusually quiet lately, which in my experience meant she was either plotting something or had found a new target for her regulatory obsessions. I'd seen her standing at her back window more frequently than usual, and she'd been taking what appeared to be photographs of various neighbors, properties with a digital camera that looked like it belonged in a nature documentary. The girls were excited about the pool renovation. Emma, who was 12 and had inherited her mother's practical nature, had already started researching different pool maintenance techniques online. Lily, also 12, but with a more artistic temperament, had drawn up elaborate plans for a pool party celebration once the work was complete with decorations, music playlists, and a menu that included at least 7 different types of snacks. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and it reminded me why I was doing this in the first place, to restore our backyard oasis to its former glory. Sarah had been supportive but cautious. She'd dealt with Karen's complaints before, particularly after the incident with our Christmas decorations, apparently. Inflatable lawn decorations were inconsistent with the community's aesthetic standards, and she had a healthy respect for Karen's ability to turn minor issues into major headaches. Just make sure you have all your paperwork in order. She'd warned me over breakfast that morning. You know how she gets. I did know how she gets. That's exactly why I'd spent the better part of Sunday afternoon organizing a folder with copies of all relevant HOA documents, city permits, insurance paperwork, and contractor licenses. I'd even printed out the specific section of our community covenants that addressed pool maintenance, highlighting the relevant passages in yellow. If Karen wanted to challenge my decision, she'd have to bring more than just her usual bluster and vague references to HOA law. The phrase HOA law had become something of a running joke in our neighborhood. Karen used it constantly, as if our community covenants were some sort of constitutional document backed by the full force of the federal government. She'd wave around her printed copies of the HOA regulations, like a police officer brandishing a warrant, completely oblivious to the fact that most of her interpretations were either completely wrong or applied to situations that didn't actually violate any written rules. But despite her often incorrect interpretations, Karen had managed to create a climate of fear among some of the newer residents. The Johnsons, who'd moved in just 6 months ago, had already received 2 formal complaints about their garbage can placement and had started asking neighbors for advice before making any changes to their property. The elderly couple at the end of the street had actually hired a landscaping company to remeasure their hedge height, after Karen had measured it herself with a tape measure and claimed it exceeded the maximum allowable height by 2 inches. It was this atmosphere of regulatory terrorism that had made me hesitant to drain my pool in the first place. But standing there in my backyard, looking at water that was rapidly approaching the consistency of primordial soup, I realized that I'd reached my breaking point. I was tired of living in fear of Karen's complaints, tired of second-guessing every decision about my own property, and tired of allowing one person's obsession with rules to dictate how I maintained my home. The decision felt liberating and terrifying at the same time. I knew that draining the pool would likely trigger Karen's radar, and I was prepared for the inevitable complaints, phone calls, and dramatic confrontations that would follow. But I was also determined to stand my ground this time. I'd done my homework, followed all the proper procedures, and had every right to maintain my property as I saw fit within the bounds of the law and our community covenants. That evening, I called my buddy Jake, who lived 3 streets over in a different HOA community. Jake had been through his own battles with overzealous neighbors and had developed what he called the documentation strategy for dealing with busybody. Homeowners take pictures of everything, he advised. Before, during, and after. Timestamp everything. Keep records of every conversation, every phone call, every interaction. When Thursday morning arrived, with a kind of crisp autumn air that usually filled me with optimism. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and I had that satisfying feeling of a plan about to come together. I'd been awake since 6 a.m., double-checking my documentation folder and preparing coffee for the work crew that would arrive at 8, Sarah had left early for a business trip to Atlanta, kissing me goodbye with a whispered, "Good luck with Karen," and a knowing smile that said she was secretly glad she wouldn't be around for the inevitable drama. The girls were excited about what they dubbed pool renovation day. Emma had set her alarm for 7:30 so she could watch the drainage process, claiming it was like a science experiment, but bigger. Lily had prepared her camera to document the entire process for what she called her pool transformation photojournal. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and as I watched them eat breakfast and chatter about the day ahead, I felt even more confident that I was doing the right thing. 7:25 a.m. I positioned myself at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching Karen's driveway. True to form, she appeared at exactly 7:28 a.m., wheeling her oversized grocery cart to her pristine white Honda Civic. She was wearing her usual shopping uniform, a beige cardigan, sensible shoes, and what appeared to be a fanny pack that I'd learned from previous observations contained her reading glasses, a magnifying glass, and a small notebook where she recorded neighborhood irregularities during her daily activities. I watched as she performed her pre-departure ritual, checking her mailbox despite the fact that mail wouldn't be delivered for another 3 hours, walking the perimeter of her front yard to inspect her meticulously maintained flower beds, and taking what appeared to be a photograph of the Johnson's garbage can placement with her digital camera. Finally, at 7:33 a.m., she backed out of her driveway with the precision of a NASA launch sequence and disappeared around the corner. "Operation Pool Liberation is a go," I announced to the girls, who giggled at my dramatic tone. Emma had already positioned herself at the back window with a notebook, ready to document the technical aspects of the drainage process, adjusting her camera settings, muttering about optimal lighting conditions with the seriousness of a nature documentary filmmaker. The Clear water removal truck arrived at exactly 8 a.m., followed by Rick Martinez, the pool contractor I'd hired to oversee the project. Rick was a solid no-nonsense guy in his 50s who'd been in the pool business for over 20 years. He'd seen my documentation folder during our initial consultation and had actually laughed out loud when I'd explained about Karen. "Let me guess," he'd said, "HOA Karen. We've got 3 of those in my neighborhood alone. They're like a plague of locusts, but instead of eating crops, they devour common sense and neighborly goodwill." Rick introduced me to his crew, Tommy, a young guy who handled the technical aspects of the drainage system, and Carlos, who operated the pump truck. Both were professional, licensed, and clearly experienced in what they were doing. Watching them work, I felt even more confident that this was a routine procedure that any reasonable person would understand was necessary. The initial phase went smoothly. Tommy set up the industrial-grade pump system, while Carlos positioned the truck to receive the contaminated water. They worked with the efficiency of a NASCAR pit crew, and within 30 minutes, the pump was humming steadily, and the green water was flowing through heavy-duty hoses into the truck's holding tank. Emma was fascinated by the technical aspects. "How many gallons per minute can it pump?" she asked Tommy, who patiently explained the pump's specifications and the science behind water removal. Lily was more interested in the visual transformation, taking photos from different angles and muttering about the artistic possibilities of environmental restoration. By 9:30 a.m., the water level had dropped by nearly 2 feet, and the extent of the contamination was becoming clear. The bottom of the pool was covered with a thick layer of decomposing organic matter that looked like something from a horror movie. Rick shook his head as he examined the mess. "You definitely made the right call," he said. "This would have taken weeks to clean with chemicals. And you'd have spent more on treatments than you're spending on the drainage and refill combined. Plus, there's no guarantee it would have worked. Some of this organic matter is so decomposed that it would just keep feeding the algae no matter what you threw at it." I felt vindicated. Here was a professional with decades of experience confirming that my decision wasn't just reasonable, it was the only practical solution. I made a mental note to include Rick's assessment in my documentation, just in case Karen tried to argue that the drainage was unnecessary. At 10:15 a.m., I noticed movement in Karen's backyard. My heart sank as I realized she must have cut her shopping trip short. Through the gaps in our fence, I could see her distinctive beige cardigan moving around, her garden with the agitated energy of someone who'd discovered a major emergency. She was carrying her camera and what appeared to be a measuring tape. and she was clearly documenting something with the intensity of a crime scene investigator. "Uh-oh," Emma said, following my gaze. "Karen's back early. Maybe she just—" "Mind her own business," Lily suggested optimistically. At 12, she still had faith in the basic reasonableness of adults, despite having witnessed several of Karen's previous complaints. I should have known better. At 10:22 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for Willowbrook, Estates Management Company. I answered with a sinking feeling, already knowing what was coming. "Mr. Chen?" The voice belonged to Patricia. "Williams, the property management company's customer service representative. I'm calling about a complaint we've received regarding unauthorized pool drainage at your property." "Let me guess," I said, watching Karen through the fence as she appeared to be measuring something with her tape measure. "Karen Weatherby called you." "I can't disclose the identity of the complainant," Patricia said in the carefully neutral tone of someone who dealt with Karen before. "But I need to inform you that we've received a formal complaint alleging violation of community covenants regarding water, drainage, and environmental contamination." I took a deep breath and reached for my documentation folder. "Patricia, I sent you an email on Tuesday with copies of all relevant permits, contractor licenses, and city approvals for this drainage project. Everything is completely within HOA guidelines and city regulations." "I have your email right here," she said, and I could hear papers rustling. "Your documentation appears to be in order, but the complainant is alleging that the drainage is causing environmental damage to adjacent properties and violating the covenant regarding activities that may negatively impact neighboring properties." I looked out at my backyard, where Rick's crew was working with professional efficiency. The pump was contained within my property, the hoses were properly secured, and the water was being removed by a licensed waste management company. There was literally no impact on any neighboring property. "Patricia, could you be more specific about what environmental damage is being alleged? Because I'm looking at the operation right now, and everything is contained within my property boundaries." The complainant claims that the drainage is causing, let me read this exactly, hazardous runoff that threatens the safety and sanitation of adjacent properties and violates multiple environmental protection statutes. I felt my blood pressure rising. This was classic Karen throwing around official-sounding accusations without any basis in fact. "Patricia, there is no runoff. The water is being pumped directly into a licensed waste removal truck. I can provide you with the truck's permits and the disposal facility's certification if you need them." "I understand your frustration, Mr. Chen, but I'm required to investigate all formal complaints. I need to schedule a site inspection for this afternoon." "That's fine," I said, still watching Karen through the fence. She was now standing on what appeared to be a stepladder, taking photographs over the fence line. "I'll be here all day, and I have complete documentation of everything we're doing." After hanging up, I walked over to Rick, who was supervising the pump operation with the calm professionalism of someone who'd seen every possible complication in his line of work. "We've got a problem," I said, filling him in on the complaint. "And the scheduled inspection?" Rick just shrugged. "Not the first time. Some people think pool maintenance is like performing surgery without anesthesia. They act like you're conducting chemical warfare in your backyard instead of just cleaning your pool. What should I expect from the inspection? Nothing dramatic. They'll come out, see that we're following proper procedures, check our permits, and file a report saying everything's kosher. The real question is whether your neighbor will accept that report or whether she finds some other angle to pursue." As if on cue, Karen appeared at our shared fence line. She was now carrying a clipboard along with her camera and measuring tape, and she had the determined expression of someone preparing for battle. "Excuse me," she called out, in the voice she reserved for official HOA business. "I need—" The first sign that Karen had made good on her threats came at 10:47 a.m., when I heard the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles pulling up in front of my house. Through the front window, I could see a police cruiser, a fire department SUV, and what appeared to be a city inspector's vehicle, all parked at various angles along the street. My quiet Thursday morning pool maintenance had suddenly become the center of what looked like a multi-agency emergency response. "Dad!" Emma called from the back window, her voice tight with anxiety. "There are a lot of official-looking people." Walking around our front yard, I grabbed my documentation folder and headed for the front door, my heart pounding but my resolve steady. I'd been preparing for this moment in a way for 7 years. Every carefully filed permit, every highlighted regulation, every professional consultation had been leading to this confrontation with Karen's version of reality. The first person I encountered was Officer Janet Rodriguez, a woman in her early 40s with the patient demeanor of someone who dealt with plenty of neighborhood disputes. She was flanked by Fire Inspector Mike Thompson and City Environmental Inspector David Kim, creating an intimidating tableau of official authority on my front lawn. "Mr. Chen," Officer Rodriguez said, checking her notepad, "we've received multiple complaints about unauthorized hazardous waste disposal on your property. Are you currently conducting some kind of drainage operation?" "Yes, I am," I said, holding up my folder. "I'm having my pool drained by licensed professionals. I have all the necessary permits and documentation right here." Inspector Kim stepped forward, his expression businesslike but not unfriendly. "We'll need to see those permits, and we'll need to inspect the operation to ensure it's in compliance with city environmental regulations." "Of course," I said, opening my folder. "I've got copies of everything: contractor licenses, waste, disposal permits, city drainage approvals, and HOA documentation. The work is being done by AquaClear Water Removal, and they're handling the contaminated water according to all proper protocols." Fire Inspector Thompson looked puzzled. The complaint mentioned hazardous chemicals and potential fire hazards. "Are you using any chemical treatments in conjunction with the drainage?" "No," I said, leading the group toward my backyard. "We're just pumping out water that got contaminated after Hurricane Delilah. The only chemicals involved are the normal pool maintenance chemicals that were already in the water, and those are being handled by the licensed waste removal company." As we rounded the corner to my backyard, I could see Rick and his crew had continued working professionally despite the arrival of what looked like a small army of officials. The pump was running smoothly, the hoses were properly secured, and everything was contained within my property boundaries exactly as it should be. "This is the operation?" Officer Rodriguez asked, looking around with the expression of someone who'd expected to find a much more dramatic scene. "This is it," I confirmed. Routine pool maintenance after hurricane damage left the water contaminated with organic debris. Inspector Kim walked over to examine the pump setup and the waste removal truck. He spent several minutes checking the equipment, reviewing the truck's permits, and speaking with Carlos about the disposal protocols. His inspection was thorough but professional, and I could see his expression growing more puzzled as he realized there was absolutely nothing irregular about the operation. "Mr. Chen," he said finally, "everything appears to be in order here. Your permits are valid, your contractors are properly licensed, and the waste removal is being handled according to standard protocols. I'm not seeing any environmental violations." Fire Inspector Thompson had been examining the pump equipment and chemical storage areas. "No fire hazards that I can identify," he reported. "Standard pool maintenance equipment, properly maintained and operated." Officer Rodriguez was taking notes, but I could see she was beginning to understand the real nature of the situation. "Mr. Chen, can you tell me about the complaints we received?" The caller was quite emphatic about the dangers posed by your drainage operation. Before I could answer, Karen appeared at the fence line like a jack-in-a-box, clutching her clipboard and camera with the intensity of someone who'd just discovered a major crime in progress. "Officers," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate attention. "I'm Karen Weatherby, the complainant. I demand that you shut down this illegal operation immediately." Officer Rodriguez turned to face Karen with the weary patience of someone who'd clearly dealt with similar situations before. "Ma'am, we're in the middle of conducting our inspection. Could you please tell us specifically what violations you're alleging?" Karen launched into what could only be described as a performance. She waved her clipboard dramatically, referenced multiple sections of what she called HOA law, and made accusations that ranged from environmental terrorism to property value destruction. She claimed that the drainage operation was creating toxic runoff, despite the fact that all water was being pumped into a contained truck, that the noise was violating sound ordinances, the pump was quieter than a typical lawnmower, and that the entire operation was an unauthorized industrial activity in a residential area. "Ma'am," Inspector Kim interrupted gently, "I've just completed my inspection of the operation. Everything is properly permitted and in compliance with all environmental regulations." the water is being removed by a licensed waste management company and disposed of at an approved facility." "That's impossible," Karen exclaimed, her voice rising to a pitch that made several neighborhood dogs start barking. "You can't just dump thousands of gallons of contaminated water without environmental impact studies and community approval." "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said, her patience clearly being tested, "the water isn't being dumped. It's being removed by a licensed contractor and disposed of properly. This appears to be routine pool maintenance." Karen's face was now the color of a ripe tomato. "You people don't understand. I've been monitoring this operation since it started, and I've documented multiple violations of community standards and environmental regulations." She began rifling through her clipboard, pulling out photographs and what appeared to be hand-drawn diagrams. "Look at this evidence. Unauthorized drainage, environmental contamination, violation of community aesthetic standards." Inspector Kim examined Karen's photographs with professional courtesy, but I could see him struggling not to smile. Her evidence consisted mostly of photos of the pump truck, the drainage hoses, and what appeared to be close-up shots of the green pool water, none of which showed any actual violations. "Ma'am," he said diplomatically, "I appreciate your concern for environmental protection, but these photos show a properly conducted pool maintenance operation. There's no evidence of environmental contamination or regulatory violations." That's when Karen played what she clearly thought was her trump card. She pulled out a thick folder from her clipboard and began waving it dramatically. "I have 15 years of HOA enforcement experience," she declared. "I've documented every violation in this neighborhood, and I know the regulations better than anyone." Section 4.3 of the Community Covenants clearly states that no homeowner may engage in activities that negatively impact neighboring properties. Officer Rodriguez looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Mr. Chen, how is your pool maintenance impacting neighboring properties?" "It isn't," I said simply. "Everything is contained within my property boundaries, and the waste is being removed by a licensed company, but it is impacting my property." Karen shrieked. The noise, the disruption, the visual pollution of having industrial equipment. "In a residential area, my property values are being destroyed by this unauthorized industrial operation." Fire Inspector Thompson, who had been quietly observing this exchange, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, with respect, this equipment is quieter than most lawn maintenance equipment, and pool maintenance is a normal residential activity. There's no industrial operation here." Karen's composure, which had been hanging by a thread, finally snapped completely. "You people are all incompetent. I'm calling the mayor. I'm calling the county commissioner. I'm calling the state environmental agency. This is a conspiracy to allow environmental destruction in our community." She stormed back toward her house, muttering about cover-ups and corruption, leaving the three officials standing in my backyard with expressions ranging from bewilderment to barely suppressed amusement. Officer Rodriguez closed her notepad with a sigh. "Mr. Chen, I apologize for the disruption. We're required to investigate all complaints, but it's clear that your operation is completely legal and properly conducted. We'll be filing a report stating that no violations were found." "Thank you," I said, feeling a wave of relief mixed with vindication. "I appreciate you taking the time to investigate thoroughly." Inspector Kim shook his head as he gathered his equipment. "In 20 years of environmental inspection, I've never seen someone so worked up about routine pool maintenance. You handled this very professionally, Mr. Chen." As the officials departed, I felt like I'd won a major battle. Karen's threats had backfired spectacularly, and now I had official documentation that my pool drainage was completely legal and properly conducted. Rick's crew had